Welcome to the Q-MindBody Podcast. My name is Darren, and in this podcast, we talk about all things having to do with gay men's wellness, spirituality, self-improvement, and just being better versions of ourselves. Today's podcast is going to be brand new for me. I'm trying something really, what I think is going to be fun. We'll see in the end. I have a returning guest, Paul Michael Winters. He is an author. We talked to him a little while back about his first book, which was a young adult queer-themed novel called Together in a Broken World, which I loved. His new book is being released right about the time this podcast is being released, and it's called The Haunting Between Us. And I really wanted to get Paul back on because I loved the last conversation. I'm excited about the new book. I've read a good part of it now, and it's awesome. But I thought since it is a young adult novel, what if we got a young adult perspective? So I've invited Cam to join us. Cam is, I've known Cam since he was in kindergarten, and he is here to give a younger perspective and to make me feel really old because now Cam is a young man, and I'm really proud of all that you've done. So we're both going to be asking Paul some questions and lending some perspective. If you want to learn more about Cam or follow his work, he's a musician and a lot of his videos are available on YouTube. I will link to those in the show notes. And then pmwinters.com is Paul's website where you can learn about his books. And of course, I will also link to his books on Amazon so that you can grab a copy if you like. Finally, if you'd like to join the Q-MindBody community, we have a Facebook group. You can follow, like, share, subscribe to this channel wherever you're listening or watching. And of course, drop your comments and we will all pay attention to them and do our best to respond. With that, I'm going to bring in Cam and Paul, and we're going to talk about Paul's new book. How are you both?
Very good, thank you.
Yeah, I'm good. Just kind of surviving, existing.
So what I'd like to do, Paul, we're going to learn a little bit about you in a minute, but since you're a returning guest, I'm going to turn to Cameron first. Cam, welcome. I'm wondering if you could just briefly say a little bit about who you are and why you think I may have invited you on this podcast.
Yeah, so I do like a lot of most of what I do is actually like, music related. I do like vocal covers and stuff like that. I'm super into heavy metal and like, all of that. It's like very, very brutal stuff. And so I'm 14. I'm an out and proud, gay teen, and I am really looking forward to being on this interview because, I think you guys, sort of wanted like, a young perspective for a young adult novel. And I'm super stoked to be bringing that for you guys to see what I bring to the table, what I contribute, and how my perspective as a gay teen sort of contributes to the overall discussion of Paul's new book.
I'm wondering, Paul and I are roughly the same age. I think I'm maybe a decade older or something, but we're up there. We're a few years older than you. Our coming out stories were probably quite different than yours, and you don't have to go into a lot of detail, but I'm wondering what that was like for you. When you say I'm 14 and I'm out and proud, that's something that was the furthest thing from my mind at 14. I was very much living in shame, living in the closet. How did your parents respond? I know the answers to some of these questions, but how did your parents respond? How did your friends respond? How was that for you coming out?
So my parents were like, they were really cool about it. They were the kind of parents that we grew up in, or I grew up in a supportive community, and they were the kind of parents that sort of planned for having, a potentially queer child basically from the moment of conception. So like it was really, I really never even had to sort of come out per se. I was just like sort of over like a morning bowl of cornflakes. I was like, hey, mom and dad, I'm bi. And then later, hey, mom and dad, I'm gay, because, had a brief trip on the by train before I caught the last train to Gayville, you know. And my friends, that was a different story. Coming out to my friends, I came out, the time that I realized I was gay was when I was at a Catholic school. So it was a little bit rougher than it could have been, but also it was about as supportive as a Catholic middle school can be, so it wasn't super bad either. So overall, pretty smooth. Definitely not as rough as it could be.
Thank you for sharing that. Paul, one of the things I love about your books, one, they speak to me because I'm a 15-year-old closeted gay man reading this book saying, where was this when I was that age? But also, I think for people Cam's age to have representation, to hear these stories, I'm wondering if you could just reflect a little on your own coming out and how that has influenced writing these really fun books that we'll get into that in a moment, but have like this deeper message that can lift all of us up, but particularly younger people who might be drawn to these books.
Yeah, of course. So I'm Paul McWinters. I'm as we mentioned, I'm author of queer, primarily YA novels, and my goal going in, I've always been a writer my whole life, but I never quite found, my true muse, like really the passion I needed to have the work to get a novel done. And I kind of discovered that like after watching like movies like Love, Simon and Heartstopper, and they just had such an impact on me. So my coming out journey was similar to yours, Darren, in that no one in my school was out at all, period. If you were even suspected of being gay, you were ostracized, bullied. I never heard of anyone getting beat up, but I know that was very common. And so we sort of were robbed of our normal childhood. And so these books, kind of serve a few purposes. One is, of course, for young adults reading it, I want them to have stories that have people like them in it that, isn't like completely focused on their sexuality and, oh, we're gay and these are all our trials and tribulations because of that. I just want to have an adventure that has gay characters. And of course, their queerness informs themselves and the story because it's just a part of them and it's impossible to not do that. But I really wanted to give people a story where they just saw themselves. In addition, like myself, watching shows like Love, Simon and Heartstopper is very cathartic for me to be able to read these stories and kind of sort of live vicariously through these characters for what my life could have been like had we lived in kind of a more accepting world. And so that's a huge purpose. And then the third audience is, non-queer people. I want to give them a story that kind of gives them a framework for, hey, here's what the world ought to be like. Because I tend to try to write in a world that I hope can be. So that kind of gives you some idea of my arc of what I intended. So.
Well, it's interesting because my son read your first book, the one that we, Together in a Broken World. My son is friends with Cam. They went to grammar school together, so knew each other from kindergarten to fifth grade, and still see each other from time to time. And he identifies as straight, and he loved the book. So it definitely is not That's just great. For one kind of person. I'm wondering, and Cam, maybe you can, I'll ask a question, maybe you can piggyback on this with your own insights or your own version of the same question, maybe. One of the things I like about your writing is that your characters are pretty complex, in that like one of the characters has some body shame issues. To complicate things for this interview, his name is Cameron. Book Cameron has some body shame issues.
I'm a twink.
And that is a part of the story of him sort of coming to terms with the fact that no one's ever going to love me because I don't look like what a man is supposed to look like. And it's interesting to see him grapple with that. That's something I think many of us do. And Cam, you might want to add to that question, but yeah, I'm wondering if you could reflect on that. Cam, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, yeah. So like one of the questions that I kind of one of the thoughts that I kind of had about this story was like, you know, Cameron and the other main character, Hugo, they each have their own like unique struggles that are like unrelated to their being queer. Like, you got Cameron who has like, a little bit of a spare tire around the waist, right? And then you've got like Hugo who is Latino. And so those are two issues like completely unrelated to their queerness, but they're still like, things that they're bullied and picked on for. So I was just like, kind of had that question, like, how did you kind of get into that mindset where you're like thinking about not just how these characters are queer and how they're bullied for that, but how they also have these issues, or not issues, but like what they perceive to be issues that are unrelated to that they also get picked on for, sort of.
Yeah, that's a great question. So whenever you kind of come up with a novel, one of the important things to do to really help people connect to the characters is to give them flaws, and kind of give them some kind of character arc, some kind of challenge that they have to overcome. And one of the best ways to do that is to draw from your own life and your own experiences. You can't always do that exclusively. But in this case, I think like Cameron is probably the closest character to myself that I've ever written, because I had the same kind of issue. So Cameron, a lot of the people that I've read the reviews for have really kind of connected to Cameron and have, kind of described him even better than I could myself, which I always find is really interesting when readers pull more into it and explain it. They describe what he has as what's called body dysmorphia. So, he was a chubby kid growing up, which I was too, and as he kind of grew into his teenhood, he, uh, ended up, being a lot more physically active or maybe I'm just describing myself. But kind of this culture of shaming and culture of having to have a beautiful body, kind of really stuck in his mind, and you know uh, changed his perspectives, or altered his perception of himself. And he doesn't have a perfect body, even older, but he's got this horrible self-image. And so part of it is coming to terms with realizing that he doesn't have to have a perfect body, that there are people that love him for who he is. It's not something that's required to be a full person. So, and then in terms of Hugo, that actually was based on a friend of mine who was a Latina, queer, lesbian, who lived that life, a nomadic life with her father, where they would fix up houses and go from house to house. And we had a few conversations about that, years ago, and that idea stuck with me, and that ended up being the character Hugo. And I added more challenges to him, like, having lost his mom and having to deal with the trauma with that. And, I pulled from other people, that I know have had similar experiences for that. So,
yeah. Cam, would you like to ask a question?
Sure. So like, I sort of like jumped out of bed at like well after 9 last night. Like, shit, I need to write some questions for this interview. So like, and the first question I came up with was like, these characters, specifically like Cameron and Hugo, a lot of the aspects of who they are as the main characters feel very uniquely relatable to me. Like, what sort of, thinking, like, sort of got you into that mindset where you're writing these very, like, these characters that have, even though they have their own like separate issues that you can't necessarily relate to, they have these, like, not necessarily universal, because being queer isn't universal, right? But like these issues that you relate to very much as a person, that, because I
Yeah.
just felt very, very understood in these characters.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, they're teenagers, right? And
Yeah.
so I definitely wanted to capture that. I've also had a few comments from reviewers, both positive and negative. It's kind of interesting, so like oftentimes young adult books are kind of written really as adults, but just in teen bodies, right? Like they're thinking like adults, they're, having these kind of, adult thoughts and adult relationships, but they're teens because we wanted to make it YA. And, you end up seeing a lot of adults that love YA because, it's basically an adult book wrapped in a kid body. And I in this book, I wanted to do, I might have done that a little bit in the first book. They were older. It was a pretty intense situation. It was post-apocalyptic.
Yeah.
For the second one, I aged them down. These are 16-year-old boys, and I wanted to capture young adults. I wanted to, so I had to kind of go into the annals of my brain and remember what it was like back then. It's not based on your comment. It sounds like I got it at least somewhat right. So
yeah.
Yeah, great question, Cam. I was thinking, first the book, just generally, I don't want to give any spoilers away, but it's a haunted house story. And so there's ghosts involved. And I've always been of the belief that stories that really touch us in some way, there's the story on the surface that entertains us, and then there's the underlying sort of the Jungian archetypes that speak to different parts of who we are. And I've always felt like ghost stories and stuff about demons and whatever are really stories about our own demons and going into the dark places of our own psyche and being and confronting them. And I'm wondering, maybe on two fronts, for the reader, what demons do you hope that they can confront? Oh, and did you encounter some of your own demons as you were writing this, or your own ghosts?
Yeah, absolutely. So, excuse me. Yeah, I mean, horror, like you said, and just be clear, this is pretty light horror. I think it's more spooky. But for sure, I wanted to use kind of the spooky elements as kind of an analogy to their own struggles, and as they're battling, the ghosts, they're also battling their own demons for sure, and you'll see that throughout the story. Often the two kind of intertwine, for sure. And in terms of my own demons, like because Cameron specifically was a very personal character for me. Some of the comments I got from my very early drafts from my development editor was that Cameron was holding that I didn't have enough like internal monologue, and like that he was just sort of whatever, anytime something bad happened. He has a semi non-accepting parent that before I was just like, whatever, I'll deal with it. And I realized after that comment that I wasn't kind of bleeding on the page enough. And that, so I actually had to go back and really think about, I went through every reaction that he had throughout the book and thought, oh gosh, look, I'm clamming up my own emotions, for when I talk about this character. And so I had to kind of do some self-reflection and thinking about, put myself in his shoes and realize, what would he be really thinking? What would be his real internal monologue? And I think that advice, hopefully helped and made him a fuller, more relatable character. So.
Yeah. I have a question for both of you, actually, because I think you'll both have maybe the same answer or close to the same, or maybe very different perspectives. But how, and I think, Paul, you've already addressed this, talking about Heartstopper and Love, Simon and other popular stuff that's out there already. But I'm wondering, for you, Cam, for both of you, how do you feel? I mean, there's tons of self-help books out there and YouTube channels and podcasts like this one that talk about how you can be better a queer person. And that's great. But how do you feel like stories like this or movies, how have they helped you to not just come out, but like step into yourself to like to use an example, like Cam in the book, addressing his body issues and his body shame and his body dysmorphia. How has queer fiction and other types of storytelling, whatever the media is, helped you, each of you, to further your journey? Maybe start with Cam.
Start with me, Jesus.
Put you on the spot.
It's a tough question.
So yeah, that's a really good question, and for me, I feel like that's a really tough one. Because when I watch shows, like I've been watching Heartstopper lately, and I've been seriously enjoying it. It's like a really, really good, fantastic show. I like how it's British, so they all have really sexy accents. And so I think what it does make me feel is like really acute sensations of like whatever emotions the characters are feeling, right? Like, when those characters like Charlie and Nick, like they kiss, like that makes me feel happy because obviously they're happy. And then like when that dude, God, what's his name? Is it Aaron?
The bully.
Yeah, the bully in Heartstopper, like when he like
suddenly I'm blanking.
Bullies them, and when he does his shtick, like it makes me want to dig stuff under his fingernails because obviously that's how the characters he's bullying feel. And like it just sends those acute sensations of like kind of reflections almost of like what the characters are feeling. And I don't know.
How close is that to your own experience and the experience of your friends, like in high school?
It's
obviously it's a fictional story, but do you feel like it gets pretty close to modern day high school life?
I mean, obviously it's like a different setting, right? Like I go to like an art school, so obviously the environment there is really different than, what it is in like, Haunting Between Us and Heartstopper and all those things, right? So like, because we've got like pride flags everywhere. We've got like a GSA, we've got a whole bunch of queer kids. We're, overall like a very supportive place. But like, I think that aside from like the different environments that contribute to different levels of, difficulty coming out, there's like the universal feeling of like coming out is a struggle, whether the people around you are supportive or not. Like, because even if the people who you're, immediately surrounded by are going to be supportive, there's people out there who are not, right? So I think every, queer person's coming out experience is different. And also every queer person's coming out experience is similar in the sense that like, there are going to be people who are going to give you a really hard time along the way. And you've got to sort of develop the mentality to sort of get past that. And I don't know. I don't know if that answers your question. I'm just,
it does beautifully.
Yeah.
Paul, same question. With all the queer young adult novels you read as a teen, there were so many to pick from.
Yeah. So Yeah, when I was a teen, there was none. I think there was like the book called Front Runner, which, is also, was just a little bit controversial, because it's sort of an age gap, romance between a teacher and a student. But there just wasn't any. And not only was there not any, there wasn't any, good, pop culture, um, representation. Gays were, they, even on TV, they weren't even really called gay, but you could clearly tell the outlandish ones were the gay ones, and they never had good parts, and they were always kind of treated negatively, or laughed at. So for sure, I had a kind of a, I also knew that those were wrong. I actually also grew up in a pretty accepting family. Both my parents were theater professors, and so I was around, gay people and had kind of an accepting life. Although I also grew up in, both my parents were Catholic, but they had, left the religion, thank God. But that was still, the trappings of that were around, and the guilt was around. And so, it took a long time for my journey. I loved myself, but there was also this part of me that, this shame that came along that, was just, part of the culture. Even though I knew rationally that was, that I shouldn't be shameful, it still would crop up. And it took a long time to where I am, 100% out and 100% proud now. I simply get angry with people that, don't, that aren't accepting anymore. I'm like, come on, get with it. Like, what the heck is wrong with you? And that's, I'm happy that I'm finally at that point where, I realize that, I am 100% good person. And, I, don't need to have shame related to this, and people that shame me, they are wrong, period. And, it's, that took a while for me to get to. And a lot of that was, self-reflection and, getting to that place myself, but also having these positive role models out there, queer movies, queer books, queer celebrities, all, like, there's so many, out celebrities now, Anderson Cooper and, Neil Patrick Harris, and lots of, just really good, positive role models out there that, just can make you realize this is, Pete Buttigieg, we have some extremely positive, queer and gay role models out there now. So
I just want to say publicly that if Neil Patrick Harris and Anderson Cooper want to fight over me, I will let them. One of them will get the rose on The Gay Bachelor. Okay, both of them.
I would watch that show.
I'm going to give each of you a few minutes to say some final things about your book, about whatever you want to say. But I just want to say to both of you, both in different ways, you're doing, just by doing this podcast, but also in the other work you're doing, you're giving other people permission to feel safe. And I think that's really incredible. Like, whether it's some queer kid reading your book, Paul, either of your books, and just feeling like I'm not alone in the world, and these are characters that I can relate to, and maybe I can go into my own haunted houses and, have whatever, find love, deal with my body issues. Or Cam just being like this young, out and proud teenager who, there's probably kids in your school, or maybe some teenager watching this podcast or listening to this podcast who's like, wow, I can do that too. I can, it's really,
Yes,
I think it's the most important work as activists we can do is be out and proud and tell our stories, whether they're fiction or our lived experience stories, sharing that. So thanks to both of you for doing that. Cam, did you have something you wanted to say?
I was just gonna say, like, yeah, totally. Like, I would love it if some, like, queer teen, like, just like me, listening to this podcast, watching this whatever, and being like, I could do that. Like, yeah, do it. Don't do it the way I do it, but do it.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to give each of you a few minutes to say, ask, do whatever you'd like. But before I do that, Paul's new book is The Haunting Between Us, and his previous book is called Together in a Broken World. A visual cue. Thank you, Paul. And both are available on Amazon and Audible and everywhere awesome books are sold. His website is pmwinters.com. I should look at my notes. And I will also put links to Cameron's YouTube channel if you want to check out some of his videos and music. That said, Paul, I'm going to give it to you for a minute. Anything we missed about the book that you really want to let the world know, or anything else for that matter?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, again, shameless plug. Here's the book. I love the way the cover turned out. This is the hardcover. It's also available in paperback, Audible, and ebook. As Darren said, it's available on January 7th. It's about to come out. Not quite available yet, but on January 7th, if you pre-order, it'll be sent right to your Kindle. I would love the support. Being a queer author, isn't quite as lucrative as being a standard author. So, I fully appreciate any support I get from people, and I'm very excited for the release. So I guess that's about it. So I think it's a haunted house book, but it's also a contemporary book. If you're a fan of my first book, and if you're familiar with it, it should be similar to that in that it's a queer love story, kind of wrapped in a genre plot. This one is a little bit more contemporary, deals more with contemporary issues. But I think if you like the first one, you'll like the second one. So.
Yeah. I just want to piggyback on what you said. Supporting artists, whether they're, painters or writers, musicians that make queer stories, queer issues, queer people more visible, is huge, because if we support them, they will create more. And the world really needs that right now. So definitely. Both of Paul's books are incredible. So you got your reading list for 2025. Cam, your turn.
All right. So I have actually two more questions that I have down for this interview. There's the next one I have is kind of sort of piggybacks on the question Darren was asking earlier about like the house and stuff like that. So the question I have, that kind of relates to the house is, so you have these two main conflicts in the stories the story singular, where you have the first conflict is like the visible conflict, where you have, the Crimson House and the White Lady and all the stuff that goes on in there. And, that's the stuff you can see, right? And then you have, the non-visible conflicts, the non-physical conflicts, which are like the internal ones that the main characters, specifically like Cameron and Hugo, faced in the story. Like, I could say like the gay panic, but there's also like, deeper stuff than that. And then I was just wondering, like, how do those two main conflicts of like the visible conflict with the house and the internal conflict that goes on inside the characters, how do those two like intertwine and contrast, and how does their connection sort of like impact the characters, like existentially or otherwise?
Yeah. I mean, that's a excellent question, and it's kind of the ultimate question when it comes to books and story structure and trying to weave together character arcs with external plots. It's something that you kind of take one step at a time. As a writer, kind of my process is twofold. I both plan out everything with an outline, and have not only plan out the plot structure, but also the character story arc. So like Cameron has his body issues and they, get progressively better. He doesn't, everything isn't 100% solved, but, it improves. And so you outline those so that you have a general structure. But I also find it important myself that in the moment when I'm writing a chapter, that I don't overplan that. So it kind of comes organically. And so I'm not like rigidly trying to get to a specific point at the end of the chapter. I'm sort of letting things happen. And that way I think things feel kind of a little more natural, and things like external plot and internal emotions can tie together, because I'm really thinking about, okay, what would this character do in this situation? And what's interesting about that is sometimes the plot goes a different direction than you expected. But yeah, so I think that hopefully answers your question. You try to, you plan it all out so you have a direction you're going, but you also try to keep it organic in the moment so that it's not rigid. So,
yeah. Did you have another question, Cam?
I did have one more question. Yeah, it relates to the topic of the queerness in the story specifically. So I feel like in queer young adult fiction, it can be easy to, because you have the topic of the queerness, right, which is there, and then you have the topic of whatever other conflict is going on in the story. In this case, the Crimson House. And I feel like in queer young adult fiction, it can be easy to sort of, want the main focus to be these characters are definitely gay, and that can sort of like drown out the other things that are going on in the story that don't relate to that. And in this story, The Haunting Between Us, like that's not the case. Like it's a very excellent balance between there's the queerness going on, right? The budding romance. And then, but it doesn't like eclipse sort of the visible conflict that's going on at the Crimson House with the White Lady and all those ghosts and stuff, right? So I was just wondering, how did you sort of avoid having that topic, which can be something that you want to be a main focus? How did you avoid having that kind of eat up too much of the story?
Yeah, I mean, what you described, it was entirely intentional. It wasn't an accident at all. My first book probably was even less so. The fact that they were gay, I think I used the word gay twice in the whole book. And, it was just kind of, in a lot of queer fiction, they just call it normalizing queer fiction, queer normative world. I like it to be pretty queer normative, but I don't want to totally erase queerness, because it is unique to us. It is part of our experience. And so you have to include some of it. I decided to go a little bit farther in the second book, where I have problems with, I have a coming out scene, which in a lot of queer fiction they don't even do anymore.
Yeah.
And I have Cam's struggle with one of his parents, which is kind of sort of passive aggressively non-supportive, which I think is something that a lot of queer people deal with. Parents are like, oh, whatever, it's a phase, and they're not aggressive. They're not
got a girlfriend.
Yeah, secretly got a girlfriend, right? Which is what the dad hopes. So I did a little bit more, but I'm glad to hear from you that you think I struck the balance, because I want this to be an enjoyable story about interesting characters where queerness is an aspect of them, but like you say, it doesn't dominate the story, because that's all queer fiction was for 20 years, was oh my God, all these horrible struggles, and how depressed we all are. I just want it to be a joyful story that that has topics we deal with, but like you said, it doesn't dominate it. So I'm glad to hear you think it worked that way. So
I just about a year ago, I rewatched the movie Philadelphia, which is about a guy dying of AIDS. It's a beautiful film. It was important at the time, but it was all tragedy and death. And it was interesting to go back in that time machine to see, this is how we all lived. with this fear of like this impending doom everywhere, and people overtly saying horrible things to and about us. And while it's really important that that happened at that time, it's so refreshing to see stories like yours that are just like, oh, and he happens to be gay. It's like, and he's
Yeah.
having his first crush, and he's dealing with the ghost that lives in this creepy house next door.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
this stuff all teens have to deal with.
Right. Everyone has haunted houses they have to deal with, of course.
Yeah, all teens are like
Everyone
it's like an
has, like-
episode of Scooby-Doo.
It's like the lady with the long flowing gray hair that they have to sort of existentially
Of course.
like
Of course.
fend off.
Maybe metaphorically we all do, but
Yeah.
So a few quick things before we wrap. First, if you enjoy this conversation, please subscribe on YouTube or on your favorite podcast app. And if you can leave comments, we will keep an eye out and answer them. My one rule about comments is if you leave hateful, ignorant, or otherwise awful stuff, I just delete it. So save your time. As soon as I see it, I delete it. You can disagree, but you don't have to be. I'll sit cam on you. You Gen Zers are better at dispensing with trolls on the internet.
Just challenge me. Just put me up to the challenge. I will rebut them, and I will.
Perfect.
I'm sort of scared for them. So thank you all so much for listening. Please go out and get a copy of either or both of Paul's books. They're incredible. And we will see you in the next episode.